Hello, everyone. Welcome to my teaching learning session. We continue with BPCE, Counseling Psychology, Block 2 and Unit 6 with me with Cognitive and Behavioral Approach. And I'll be taking these BAG courses for you. And I'm Sonal. Let's continue and understand what does Unit 6 talks about. Unit 6 will talk about therapies, now coming to cognitive and behavioral aspects. These therapies are very different, very action-oriented therapies, which will not only make the client work, but at the same time will be even action oriented for the therapist equivalently. Let's go through the index of what are we going to cover today. We are going to talk about learning objectives, introduction, behavior therapy at a very extended pattern, understanding how did behavior therapy came to existence, what were its assumptions. The theoretical framework is important because we get to know what are the theories which the behavior therapy is based upon, the role of the client and the counselor, the techniques, evaluation. We need to evaluate, is the therapy really something which is away from any sort of criticism? Within that comes the behavior modification. Behavior modification is coming out of behavior therapy with slight changes in the modification of the way it is being used. Then we will start with cognitive therapy. Cognition, as it suggests, states about the process of thinking, reasoning, problem solving. So it has a therapy too in that process, and the emergence. The emergence will talk about where did cognitive therapy come into existence, and we are going to talk about assumptions. Theoretical framework, again, where is the base of cognitive therapy? What are the theories which has been the binding pillars which has led to this therapy? The role of the client and the counselor, the techniques, and we are going to evaluate. And rest we will do later. Coming to behavior and cognitive therapy, let's start with the introduction of behavior therapy. Behavior therapy, started in the early 1900. As soon as the psychodynamic and the psychoanalysis completed in the 1900s, the second half completely was given to action-oriented therapy. The reason that stated, I keep stating this, that it was an action-oriented therapy, the reason for that is that behavior and cognitive therapy made not only the therapist work, but also equivalently there were techniques which made the client function with you, which made you let you know that the client and the therapist when working together give changes not only in the cognition but also in your behaviors immediately. Also, the second half of the 20th century have brought in changes, which was this, and in the 1950s a new school of thought came up and it gained momentum for the next 20 years, which is, we if we say that these were not so rivalry to the psychoanalysis, but these were those techniques which just took over the world for the next 20 years and 2 decades. And the many and the cognitive approaches are based on two assumptions. For us to know, any kind of technique of behavior therapy, any kind of technique of cognitive analysis will be based on two major assumptions that you have. First is they emphasized on the client action on opposed to the client passive insight, which was very true. Psychodynamic and psychoanalysis always stated that there is going to be an emotional insight in the client, where the client only understands and learns about his problem. But when we talk about behavior therapy says we will make the client understand, work for it, do some action, and completely live the action per se. That means that the insight is not only restricted in just understanding, but the insight is restricted. You understand, you work for it, and you show some action, practice it, and let us know. So that was the first difference of from psychoanalysis. The second is they believe that the locus of trouble lies in the present. So, like the psychodynamic, we are not going to talk about the locus of control being in our past, being in the childhood experiences, or resting in our unconscious. Here, everything is conscious. Here, everything is in your present, which is right now, right here. Now, let's continue with emergence. Where did and who got it started? J.B. Watson is called the founder and the father of behaviorism. He stated that behaviors that are observable have scientific roots. Empirical means scientific. That will sustain in the field of psychology in the future. So, what was J.B. Watson trying to tell us? J.B. Watson always tried to dominate this concept that psychology needs scientific thought, scientific action, and that is something which can be given by behaviorism. The reason for that is behaviorism stated that behaviors are something that can be seen, something that you can see can be changed, and once change can be predicted. So any change that you do in the behavior today can be made change tomorrow and can be predicted later. So behaviorism, why was this more scientific than psychoanalysis? First is reason that we talk about, that it was something which was observable, that was seen. So something which is observable and seen can be changed, and its repercussions, consequence can further also be changed. So this was like a changing point for behaviorism from any other therapy system which was there. In the 1950s, psychologists saw the globe simultaneously beginning to develop psychotherapeutic approaches that relied on theories of learning. So, with the passage of time around 1950s and 60s, learning theories took over and became the base for behaviorism, which is it was getting applied. The learning therapies were getting applied in day-to-day problems. Then they focused another thing that contributed in the emergence of behaviorism was that it focused on the change of behaviors that make you experience the psychological distress. That means the psychological distress that is experienced is because of a behavior which is incorrect. So behaviorism spoke of changing this incorrect behavior, which was getting the psychological distress like phobia, anxiety, general anxiety disorders, tension, stress related disorders, so that the insight can be tackled and understood. So few things which this therapy gained insight was, which was the building pillars for behavior therapy, was learning principles. The learning theories was Pavlov's classical conditioning, and it was even operant conditioning of B.S. Skinner, which is mentioned above. So the base becomes classical conditioning of Ivan Pavlov and operant conditioning of B.F. Skinner and Thorndike. We had observational learning, which talks about observing, imitating, of Albert Bandura. That came at a great, that really came as taking over the entire world today. We learn most of our social norms through Albert Bandura, still very relevant, still actively happening in our world. So empirically proven, there were three theories which was leading to the therapy, which was classical conditioning of behaviorism, which was the operant conditioning, and the social learning theory. Now let's start and understand the assumptions of behavior therapy. The assumptions state that behavior is a result of the external stimuli, which is the external environment, or the internal, cognition, the thinking, the attitude, the stereotype, the opinions, the beliefs that we form. So, two things that we need to understand here is, first, that behavior is an outproduct of external factors, or it can even be due to internal factors like thinking, that could be stereotypes, it could be labels, it could be judgment, it could be opinions, etc. Another assumption that we talk about is using learning theories, a valid method to bring about significant and lasting psychological change was possible. So, with the use of Ivan Pavlov's theory, with the use of operant conditioning, we could bring about changes in the behavior, which was the goal of behavior therapy. Another thing, that the client plays an important role in decreasing the psychological distress. So the client does play an important role in decreasing the distress that you have. So the learning therapy and theories, which are a base of the behavior therapy, brings changes, and these changes are not something which is short-lived. These changes actually help you, further increase your learning patterns, also make you learn new coping mechanism, and make you more self-management, which is allow you to manage things on your own. The third assumption is the effectiveness of the therapy is measurable. That is, see, something that can be seen as a behavior can be judged when and how much is changing. So let's take an example. A person has a bad behavior of compulsive lying, or a person who has extreme amount of anxiety during his or her presentation. He or she can be made use of the behavior therapy, and in steps and stages we could see it happening. The changes in the behavior will tell us that the behavior therapy is happening. So it is scientific because it's seen, it's measurable. Now, the fifth that we talk about is that success of the therapy is marked by the translation of therapeutic new goals and not reproducing them during the session, which is very true. The success of the therapy is already planned. It's all planned. We don't get the insight within the therapy. It's all planned and seen, always in advance. So behavior therapy is very planned, very systematic, works not like the insight that you have an aha feeling and you get the result. No, it's all planned, because everything is on the basis of stimulus and response. So when your response is coming because of a stimuli, we can make changes either in the stimuli or in the response. So it's all planned, it's all very systematic, it's not reproduced, the result is not reproduced during the session. The goals, the next is that the goals can be reached if the client has self-efficacy. See, when we stated that the therapy is an action oriented therapy, the therapy talks about understanding and making changes when the two people are working together. Plus, it's not an insight driven therapy, it's an action behavior change therapy. So, with all of that, we need to know the client should equally be motivated and have a good self efficacy to work through. That means the client should never come with their minds blocked. Like, I'm going to the therapy, I don't know what's going to happen. So, here the possibility of change is less because when you are going for the therapy, you need to know that there is a possibility of change. There is a possibility that whatever that is given to me, whatever that is, the behavior problem that is coming to me is changeable, and I am going for a change and I will work through it. This suggests a very high self efficacy and high motivation in the client, which will bring changes and the desired result. Another assumption that psychological ailments are not disorder but problems in living. According to behavior therapy, the psychological distress was not ideally diseases, but the problems that you had in your way, in your behavior that led to problems of living. Then, therapeutic interventions and techniques aren't universal. So, speaking of this, we need to know they are not universal, they're not unified. You cannot use the same set of mold to solve all the problem. So, it's like you do not have one kind of glasses at home. Similarly, not all problems have similar kind of solutions. It is not universal. They have to be tailor made, they have to be customized. That's why behavior therapy is so scientific and so workable because everyone has their lock and key fit, and that fit changes as per the behavior intervention of behavior therapy. That completes with assumption to conclude that behavior therapy lives in the present. It does not just give you an insight, it is very scientific. Therapeutic goals are successfully reached when the client comes with high motivation and efficacy, and it's based on learning principles. Learning principle states that every solution is a fit, lock and key fit, and customized as per the problems of the client. It is not a unified therapy. That means not all disorders will have the same kind of technique to be managed. Now let's associate and understand the theoretical framework of the behavior therapy. So to understand what are the core pillars and the chunk of this therapy. See, the field of behaviorism started at around just after Gestalt. When we talk about the evolution of psychology, Gestalt came and then came behaviorism. Behaviorism actually revolted the fact that our minds cannot function by just making changes in the unconscious or making changes in the structure. We needed something that could make changes on something which was visible. So behaviors are visible. So behaviorism came from there. Also, behaviorism has moved from its initial conceptualization that human beings are tabula rasa by associating that human beings are beings which are actively engaging in their environment, interacting with their environment, actively constructing their environment. So, when we spoke about behaviorism, behaviorism stated from tabula rasa as a concept that we are born as a blank slate, they shifted their ideology to understand that beings like the beings are actively constructing, engaging in the environment, becoming the response as per the stimuli. So behaviorism actually is quoted stimulus response leads to behavior. So they stated that these things usually talks about the shift here. That we shifted from tabula rasa concept to stimulus response concept here in behaviorism. This was the first theoretical milestone that they covered. Then we came to the major chunk of theories that I'll just quickly do as per the pictures given. So, classical conditioning was the first theory that came under the shelter of behaviorism, which became the base for behaviorism. Classical conditioning was given by Ivan Pavlov. Ivan Pavlov stated that learning is a result of stimulus response, which means that one stimulus triggering the other stimulus leading to response. And they also associated the fact that there is a neutral stimulus that becomes the conditioned stimuli that leads to a conditioned response. So this stated that there is a stimuli which always leads to a response. We connect that stimuli to another stimuli, so it leads to SSR conditioning, and eventually this would lead to the neutral stimuli to become the major conditioned stimuli and give us the same response. Let's understand his experiment by the picture that is given, and that will help you support the understanding. See, Ivan Pavlov was a physiologist and then became a behaviorist psychologist. So he was a doctor initially, and while he was a physiologist doing his researches, he identified and noticed that his dog used to salivate every time that the food came in, which is human. That's even a human nature. Anything sweet, any eating, things which are kept in front of us. Anytime kept in front of us, we tend to mouth water. Despite we are hungry or not hungry, if it's delicious, it will lead to mouth watering. So food becomes the unconditioned stimuli. Why unconditioned stimuli? Because food is giving a response no matter what. So there is no trigger. As soon as the food comes in front, it gives the response. So this was before conditioning, before he had set up the conditioning and anything could happen. Then he realized, let me associate food with something. So he rang a bell. When he rang the bell, there were no changes. The bell is not conditioned. The bell is not having any conditioning. So what he did, he actually made an enclosure, closed a dog in that enclosure, and associated a tube from his gland, where the salivation used to occur, till a metric bowl, and checked out how much salivation did happen. So as soon as the food came in, there was a lot of salivation. So that is unconditioned stimuli leading to unconditioned response. Then he gave a neutral stimuli. Neutral stimuli is a stimuli that does not evoke any response. That means it does not give any response. So as soon as the bell was rang, there was no salivation. There is no response which is coming. So what did Ivan Pavlov thought was that let me associate the two together. That means ringing the bell, then getting the food, and then see what happens. So he rang the bell, gave the food, the dog salivated, rang the bell, gave the food, and the dog salivated. This happened for quite a number of times. That means the neutral stimuli is associated to the unconditioned stimuli that leads to an unconditioned response, which is salivation. Now, doing a trial for approximately days, one of the day, Ivan Pavlov thought, let's just, test the trial. Let me just check if it's happening or not. So he did a testing trial, which is after conditioning, rang the bell, and realized that the dog was salivating. Why did this happen? Because the dog felt that the bell will come and then the food comes. So he was associating the bell to the food after training, after classical conditioning, which is CS. Associated to UCS leads to CR, which is the bell associated to the food leads to salivation. So that was the SSR conditioning, which was the first pattern that was there of Ivan Pavlov. After this came an instrumental conditioning. Instrumental conditioning was far more different from classical conditioning. Classical conditioning was the first conditioning that we had. Then came B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner stated that the model of learning focuses on giving rewards to people after the response so that they could change the intensity of the response. So here the equation becomes stimulus response consequence. That means all the response is coming because of the consequence, which is also called as the consequential learning. Giving an example, there's a student who does not do well in its maths exam, and stimuli is the maths exam. The results are coming out to be as failed. The child is failing every time. So the mother, after a lot of practice, sitting with the child, realizes that the child does not learn, does not have the motivation to do it. He is given a equation. So you during your math exam perform well, pass with an adequate number, or pass exam in the beginning, and I'll make you, after every good result, I will make you your best meal, probably a Maggie or a sweet dish that the child wants. So this is stimulus response and reward, which is the consequence. Now the child is learning because of the reward, not because of the fact that he or she wants to do it. So that is also called the consequential learning. These rewards are called reinforcement. What does the reinforcement does? It increases the likability that your desired behavior will always come. One is reinforcement. Another way of making instrumental conditioning learn was punishment. This is to control the behavior. So punishment decreases the undesirable behavior quickly. So for example, a child is lying, a child is probably not showing his or her marks on time. The mother literally punishes the child in terms of not letting him go to play, does not speak to the child. Could be physical, stated things, and little children are beaten a little to make them realize that what they're doing. So what are they doing is wrong. So punishment decreases the likability that your undesirable behavior comes in, and reward and reinforcement increases the likability that the reinforcement comes in. So there are three important things which was happening in operant conditioning. Positive reinforcement is giving a reward just after work, which is you finish your homework early and you get to go to movies is a reward. So the child finishes homework to go for the movies. In negative reinforcement is a little different. This again increases the desirability of good behaviors, but here, the child dislikes the stimuli, that's why he or she is doing the response. That means to avoid an aversive, unpleasant stimuli, child does a response, which is, let's take an example. To stop buzzing in the car, you have to roll up to the window. So to stop buzzing sound in your car, you actually have to roll down the window. So every time there's a buzzing sound, you roll down the window. So to desired response is that. Again, similar example, people do not cross the red lights and there are lesser amount of accidents, there are fines. So you don't skip the red light, there are fines. So to avoid the fine, you do a desired behavior of not skipping the red light. So this is like one of those ways of telling a positive reinforcement. Positive reinforcement also increases the desired behavior, but in a different pattern. Then we come to punishment. This completely decreases your behavior. For example, parents taking away your cell phone when they realize that you increasing the phone bill or you're not performing well. So these were two, which was operant and classical conditioning. Operant here, the subject learns to associate it with a consequence. Like the dog runs the pulley to get the bone, and in the classical conditioning, the subject learns to associate two stimuli. So the first classical conditioning is is associationism, where operant conditioning is consequential learning. This completes two major base theories of behaviorism. Now let's come to the last theory which talks about Albert Bandura's social learning theory. Albert Bandura's social learning theory was based again on an experiment that was done with children. The reason classical conditioning and operant conditioning were important mode of learning, but this was equally important because we need to understand the roles of values, attitude, everything happens through the process of learning. Children observe, children take instructions from parents to do such things, which is learning to say please, learning to say thank you. It also maximally comes from something which we state as observational learning. Also, the bad behaviors, learning from wrong peers comes from social observational learning. This set of experiments started doing around, and Albert Bandura took small children as their experiment, as took their subject because of the fact that aggressive behaviors was increasing at that point of time around 1970s and 80s in children, and the reason was television. The reason was extreme violence seen in television. So Albert Bandura thought that this violence is increasing because of the fact that the children are watching series and television, which is extremely violent. So he did an experiment which was called the Bobo doll experiment. This is one of the most famous experiments done on children to exhibit that learning also to a greater level happens through observation of the role model, and these role models are rewarded, and you feel that if you do the same behavior you would be equally rewarded and acclaimed, and the same amount of achievement will take place. This completes with the three major theory that states and tells us that what is the basis of behaviorism. Now let's come to the role of the client in the therapy. What does the client does? As I said in the beginning, this is a very active therapy. There is an active participation, remember, of the client in this therapy. The client, the therapist is not functioning alone. The client is equally contributing. Speaking of that, when we say that the client equally contributes, that means the client is being cooperative, the client is self-monitoring their behavior changes also. So this is like the subject here is very alert during the therapy. The subject is a learning subject, motivated subject. Then only there are changes which is going to eventually come quickly in the behavioral therapy. This also allows the client to increase his or her behavior repertoire, which again depends on the client. See, once the client is very active, once the client is very functional, motivated, willing to work and make changes, remember the changes that he monitors himself will be brought about faster than the other. Then, what is the kind of relationship between the client and the counselor here? The behaviorist understands the appeal of the client to be very warm and empathetic in the therapy. That means it states that the attributes are sufficient to be changing. That means the relationship between the client and the counselor should be so rewarding and so good and so compassionate that both should be willing to be working towards the problem. So the client's respect towards the therapist is equally important. Knowing that the therapist is working for them is equally important, because once the client becomes equally action oriented, that means once they know that they're also working, they should not belittle the therapist, stating that I'm the only one who's working. No. The respect towards the therapist is very essential for the therapeutic relationship to be formed, to professionality to prevail, and to the fact once you respect somebody, you have that confidence that that therapist, that person in charge will look forward to solve your problem, and you will then deliver the right kind of solutions to the therapist and also trust them. You believe in the confidentiality. So here, the therapist does believe that the counselors are problem solvers who direct the client to move them from the problems to the adaptive behaviors. So the change makers who are who? The counselors. The cooperative and the monitor therapist should be motivated in providing respect. If this is done, remember the client counselor relationship is a complete, a complete success. Then moving to the techniques. Behavior techniques are umpteen in number, because this was one of the first therapy which had so many techniques in consideration. Because one, it was a very active therapy. Secondly, your behaviors are being changed. We need to know every kind of behavior will have a different kind of solution. The first that we focus on is relaxation training. Relaxation training focuses on you achieving a mental and muscular relaxation. The client is initially given extensive instruction and then expected to practice on their own. So, this usually happens when you imagine any anxiety provoking situation and we are making you relax. With the passage of time, the client learns to relax on its own. So, again, a very self trained and self managing technique. Then we come to role play. A very interesting ways of managing role plays are have been always very interesting, and role plays have always been very action oriented also. After agreeing upon a behavior that they would like to change or get help on, the client and the counselor now engages in a role play. So let's take an example. Someone, as given an example, has social anxiety. So as we talk about the social anxiety, we find it hard to communicate in the environment. So as soon as we find it hard to communicate in the environment which are containing strangers, the counselor in this case would assume to become a stranger, and the client becomes the one who is interacting with the stranger. What is the role play exhibiting? The client becomes a stranger, the counselor becomes a stranger, and the client XYZ is now trying to interact with the stranger, which is the client. This happens in stepwise. First, for example, going and saying hello to the stranger. Then we tell them to interact when the number of stranger increases, and then going to say hello to a particular stranger. Then we increase the intensity further of the role play. We ask them to interact with more than multiple people, increase the number of people around the therapist, which is two or three, and then the client has to interact with all three of them. This role play allows them to do what they could have done in a very anxiety provoking situation, in a situation which has been manageable, in a situation where they can take control. So role plays are extremely good, and it's seen that the result of role plays are humongous, positively humongous. Then we talk about graded assignment. Graded assignment is a tandem with your behavior. Some assignments are given, for example, same thing, that the client is told to interact with two people, two strangers, wish them and greet them when they get back home. So this is like a graded assignment. And graded how? First speaking to one person, then speaking to two, then speaking to two people when there are multiple people around, then speaking to an entire group of people, which is a chunk of five people in a group. So that is graded assignment that you ask them to do. So this is again extremely great, extremely functional. Also, at times when the client loses themselves in any of the grade, they can understand the anxiety at that stage is extremely high and they have to work more on that. Then there are activity scheduling. Activity scheduling refers to the creation of a daily routine or a to-do list or an activity list schedule. The therapist and the client creates this list together, and this helps the client to prioritize that what actually leads to maximum amount of anxiety and how they can go in terms of grading it and working towards the therapy. Then there is pleasure rating. Pleasure rating is one of those techniques which relies on pleasure that is received from the positive reinforcement. Let's take an example. A therapist provides a task where the reinforcement is so pleasurable that it actually outperforms the pleasure which was received initially. Remember, if the it's stated that the therapist asks the client to chart how much pleasure he or she anticipates after performing an activity, before performing an activity, desired behavior, and the pleasure that he or she received. Remember, if the pleasure received exceeds what he or she thought, the next time the behavior is going to be stronger. That means, for example, if the same individual who has social anxiety, we give them a reward. We give them that once you talk to one person, you get the ability to sit and watch a movie at home. So the fact that the person has social anxiety does not like going watching movies, so we allow them to watch a Netflix. So that's another thing. So we allow them to watch any series on the OTT. So this is sitting back into that's a reward. Now remember when the client got the series are multiple and got the opportunity of watching it two to three episodes together. The pleasure is more. So the pleasure received from the reward was more. Now remember the desired behavior is going to be far more. The client feels that the pleasure which is coming from the the reward is so more. I need to perform better now. So it's pleasure rating. It depends upon the kind of pleasure which you receive from the positive reinforcement. Then we talk about systematic desensitization. This is again especially developed by Wolpe to cure phobia. And again, it grades the phobia into hierarchy. And then we start from the least provoking stimuli to the most threatening, graded and alternated with relaxation procedure. And this say that, for example, a client is scared of rejection. So we make a hierarchy of the rejection to understand that where the client is getting stuck. So it could be from the least anxiety provoking rejection to the highest anxiety provoking rejection. We pick up each hierarchy graded, which is alternated with relaxation technique. That's how we systematically desensitize the phobia with the help of relaxation at every stage. Then there is flooding, like the term suggests. Flooding talks about a vivo vivo condition where this technique exposes the client to the threatening stimuli directly and fully, and after teaching them relaxation. So we teach them a good amount of relaxation technique and we throw them into the pool of strangers, so that they can relax on their own. When they see the strangers coming them, they refuse friendship. If they feel threatened, they move away, they relax at a corner. So this is completely flooding them with with the anxiety provoking stimuli. Then we come to aversive therapy, extremely important. It is used in de-addiction centers. It's for de-addiction of drinking, smoking, drug addiction. The therapy states that we pair the undesirable behavior with an aversive consequence. That might mean that is, there is a stimuli which is smoking. Stress causes you to smoke. So as soon as there is stress, you end up picking up one cigarette, then another cigarette, then another cigarette. This, when we speak of, when we are talking about one cigarette, another cigarette, as soon as you have that, you have an aversive consequence, which is you feel pukish, you feel nausea. So every time that you're smoking, you feel nauseatic. There's a stomach ache, there is a loose stomach. Remember, this aversive conditioning makes you feel very uncomfortable with the fact that you're smoking every time. So this reduces, and this is extremely useful for drug addiction, drinking, smoking, etc. Then there is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Similarly, like systematic desensitization, this technique is employed vastly for a solution for trauma. The goal of this technique is to minimize the trauma, minimum exposure to trauma, and to rewrite the memories to have more adaptive solutions. So it's like why it said as eye movement desensitization, we tell them to imagine whatever happened at that point of time with minimum exposure of the trauma. We make them rethink very less amount of troubles, write the memories, and then try to discuss what could have been an alternative that they could have done so that it would reduce their anxiety. So this is something which is completing the techniques. Imagining behavior therapy is filled with technique. The reason it's a customized, tailored therapy. That's why. Then evaluation. See, it has great amount of application. The evaluation is used for anxiety, phobia, any kind of phobias, general anxiety disorder, huge amount of things it is used for. Critical evaluation of both therapy and the client. Neither what the therapist offer nor what the client think are unconditionally accepted. The therapist continually evaluates his intervention empirically and also challenges the client's assertion of his limitation. So the critical evaluations that both are working. One is working for getting unconditionally accepted. The other is moving towards the intervention. Why? The game changers are therapists. Solution dwellers are therapists. They continuously keep, working for the therapist good behaviors. And whenever there's a problem behavior coming into play, their work again starts in a chain. Then, ethical benefits is positive inclination. A behavior therapist has a clear cut boundary, and transfer of learning is huge here. People learn new behaviors, new ways of working, new ways of learning. So, it's a complete transfer of knowledge. Time and money affected, yes. As in comparison to psychoanalysis, this is time bound. Finishes, it's quite a short term therapy, finishes in 5 months at time, 4 months at time, 6 months at time, 3 months, and it's quite cost benefit. Temporary and cost benefit, a little convenient also. It has a global reach. This therapy has reach for behaviors across the globe. All the maladaptive behaviors, which are behaviors that are not adaptive, of various formats. That's the evaluation. Let's come to the limitation. The power balance between the client and the therapist is a problem. At time when the counselor is too driven, it becomes very difficult for the client to run along with the therapist. So it's like it becomes an obligation that I'm a student, so I must learn. There are days when the client feels very heartless, very emotionless, but then when the therapist is so charged, you'll end up have to working through, because it's like a student teacher relationship where you have to learn and imbibe what is given. So that's like a very problematic power balance in this therapy. Then symptom focused solution. Behavior therapy aims at changing behavior, the symptom which causes the undesirable behavior, which is through the learning, which suggests we don't deal with emotions, we don't deal with changing emotional words, we don't deal with changing social environments. As I just stated, there are times that are emotionally feeling low, we're feeling less, we're feeling uncomfortable. So they don't take in consideration of changing emotions, changing social conditions. So that's like a biggest drawback that we have. Then there is behavior modification that we have. Behavior modification was given by Mackenbaum. It used the same technique to modify the behaviors. So it was the same technique, aimed to change behavior with the same techniques that we did. Mackenbaum was, his therapy was built to help the client develop skill to deal with their own stress. So that's why he developed therapies and stated them as stress inoculation technique. He changed the maladaptive behavior to adaptive behaviors by developing these same skills in the client. So here we make the client self-help person. So this is Mackenbaum's concept, primarily talking about three changes: self-observation, starting a new dialogue with yourself, and learning a new skill. So identifying where's the problem, studying the problem, starting a new dialogue with the problem. When the adaptive dialogue comes in, making that change. So that is something that we talk about is behavior modification. Then there is cognitive therapy that we start with today. Cognitive therapy is very equivalent to behavior therapy. Changing bad behaviors, cognitive therapy is changing the wrong thinking, cognition that impacts your emotions, your thoughts, gives you negative interpretation, gives you overthinking that children do today. So, giving you an alternative thinking pattern. What are the assumptions? People's cognition are made up of both kinds of thoughts: good thoughts, bad thought, inappropriate thoughts. So, we are a combination of this, which leads to problems. Human minds are capable of secondary therapy, which is human minds are capable of secondary cognitive therapy, which is cognitive therapy believes that internal communication can be and should be audited. That means it should be changed. So, what is the main aim of cognitive therapy? Changing the thought, thinking, reasoning, problem solving, which is causing you problem. So, examine the thought, make changes. Then this therapy realizes on the fact that on the same fact of behaviorism which I stated, and it is empirical testing, has lot of techniques and has less amount of technique, but again is empirical like behaviorism. Why? Thinking can be spoken out, thoughts can be, your reasoning, your memory, your judgments, your opinions can be spoken. So when it can be spoken, it is more objective. So and also at times there is probability when we talk about cognitive therapy, it will fail to deal with problems when it is not empirically stated. When cognition cannot be tested, it will be rejected. Then, unlike behaviorism, cognitive therapy gives more authority to the client. The client has more authority, has more, not the power, but authority to make change. Then, therapeutic goal is to make changes in the cognitive schema. which is making changes in your thought process. Schemas are your mental framework about object, event, situation. Theoretical framework, where did it come from? It came from three factors: core beliefs, dysfunctional thoughts, and negative automatic thoughts. So the first therapy was given by Aaron Beck, 1976, pointed out there are three levels of cognitive model that we have in our mind: core beliefs and schemas, dysfunctional assumptions, negative automatic thoughts. So speaking of this, human mind consists of thousands of schemas. Schemas are what? Schemas are information, mental representation of object events in situation. They are objective because they will always remain the same. They are factual. So if you made a schema about a person being unfaithful, remember you have a lot of attitude, opinion, action that the person has done that you've rated himself to be unfaithful. Schema about that person, factual, objective because you've seen his behavior. Behaviors are objective in nature. They are deeply ingrained. They can become stereotypes. The core beliefs are at times not changeable. It's difficult to change them. It actually paints all your experiences to good and bad. For example, child when young was scolded of being useless. The child might call himself, I am not worthy, I am useless. So this, if get reinforced outside by school, will never change. Gets ingrained in the child in the future that I am like that. People dislike me. Then we come to something which is dysfunctional beliefs. These are irrational beliefs. These are dysfunctional, has no fact. You just keep thinking, I'm worthless. How did you make it rational that you're worthless? You have just a thought pattern of people that has made you feel that. Your behaviors do not justify it. So these are dysfunctional beliefs. Your beliefs, which are not logical, not factual. Then we have negative automatic thoughts. As soon as these beliefs, dysfunctional thought comes in day-to-day living, remember they will corrupt all your thoughts automatically. So if you're sitting in a room doing something, you feel, I will not do this because I'm not capable, I'm worthless. Someone tells you to do an activity, you say them a no because you feel that I'm not worthless, so I am worthless. So that suggests that this actually becomes a negative automatic thought. This leads to cognitive distortion, a bigger chunk. What are distortions? Negative, irrational patterns of thinking, which diminishes your motivation, level of working, lower your self-esteem, your vigor to work, and leads to depression, anxiety, and substance abuse. There are a lot of cognitive distortion. One is mental filter, emotional reasoning, where you see a current emotion and judge everything. So if you're feeling sad right now, emotional reasoning, judge everything wrong. All or nothing thinking, has to happen or never have to happen. No mediation, very incorrect it is. Catastrophizing, exaggerating the problem. My problem is this bad, oh my god, this will corrupt every state of my life. We do that. Catastrophizing is such a common problem. Mental filter, focusing on only one aspect of situation while overlooking all the positive aspects. So if your friend has done one thing wrong, you judge your friend to be a bad friend. You never thought that that friend helped you, probably support in your in giving you notes, being there for you. You forget everything. Personalization, blaming yourself for every problem, that's personalization. Labeling, using sweeping and negative statements that people use to describe, and you use it negatively for yourself. Yes, people are right, I am negative, I am bad. So you're labeling yourself time and again. Jumping to conclusions are like literally feeling like mind readers. That person did not like me because I am not a good person. I probably don't solve problems. So this is jumping to conclusion. Shoulds and must of your life, that's again an unhelpful thinking pattern. I must go to school. I should help everybody. No, there are problems and days that you cannot, and there are problems that you do not have the resource. Why do you help every day, every time? Overgeneralizing is interpreting a single negative event as the norm and as a pattern. So, for example, if you've not done something, you state that you label yourself. That is, you now come to labeling yourself, which is overgeneralizing. One single incidence changes all your lens. So, these are cognitive distortions we have, which is approximately 9 in number. Remember that we don't use it in day to day lives. What is the therapeutic technique of cognitive therapy? Completely relies on the more or less similar to behavior therapy. Negative thought pattern, needs to recognize that pattern and change it with an alternative good thinking pattern. So what do they state? Prevent the what do behavior cognitive therapy deal with? Changing your personality factors, recognizing cognitive abnormalities. Cognitive anomalies are the cognitive distortion. Goal of the therapy: changing your irrational thought into the rational one so that it does not impact your personality, does not lead to any disease. there's only one technique that we have in cognitive therapy. This is called Socratic questioning. This is called Socratic, which is open-ended questioning, which is non-threatening, very guided question, no pinpointed questions per se, but thoughtful pinpointed questions, which encourages the client to reflect on their problem, not feel, does not feel threatened, and this leads to amazing rapport formation. After this, let's come to the role of the therapist. What is the role? So, did you realize behavior therapy is multiple techniques? Cognitive therapy is having the same framework that we will make changes in the faulty cognition, which is cognitive distortion. The distortion that we just did at the back, which are these nine distortion, making changes in them, but using only one kind of technique they had, which was called as Socratic questioning, guided discovery, series of open-ended, thoughtful, pinpointed questions, which encourage the client to reflect on their problems. So, thoughtful, pinpointed questions are non-probing, non-threatening, not directly directed on why didn't you not do it? Why did you call yourself worthless? We don't question like this. We ask them, has there been times that these thoughts come to you mostly? If the client says yes, can you tell me some incidences where you felt that it was you, that you felt that this kind of thought which is coming to you regularly? This is where it's pinpointed to situation and not what, when, and how. Now, what is the role of the therapist here? The therapist brings knowledge to the therapy, the knowledge about the cognition. So, again, the change maker is who? The therapist. Understands the bad cognition, understand where is it coming from, understanding the cognitive distortion, where is the cognitive distortion coming from, and how to combat it. Which is we try to rip off the cognitive distortion using the guided Socratic questioning. The knowledge here of the client, of the therapist, is directive engagement, questioning, then accelerating the pace of questioning to discover the problem, solving the problem with doing what? Rational thinking, guiding it with a rational thinking, and then collaboratively working together. So, collaboration is a feature of cognitive therapy. That's something which we talk about as the relationship too. Now, what's the role of the client here? Role of the client when we talk about cognitive therapy is to recognize the distortion along with the client. So it's like speaking out that distortion, which is realize bias information processing, which is where have you been biased from the unbiased one, systematically removing that biases from your mind or removing that distortions from your mind, which is being able to equally work through to identifying what are your distortions, realizing that distortions and working towards it. Then we have client counsel relationship. Here, the client counsel relationship is quite similar. It is quite similar here, like the behavior therapy. Does have a student teacher approach, like the approach of the behavior therapist, and the complete agency to the client and approach of the humanistic therapy is taken. So, game changers are again the therapist, you listen and cooperate and work together. So, again, the client counsel relationship is based on a student teacher relationship. The approach is that yes, the complete agency is to the client, which is the changing will be done to the client, and the change makers are the therapist. Now, let's evaluate the therapy. Is it really similarly equally active like behavior therapy? It is a contribution to depression at a greater level. Why? Depression starts from the mind, the negative catastrophizing, the labeling, the overgeneralization. So, when it's in the mind, your thinking, reasoning, problem solving shuts down. Cognitive therapy will come into play to make you recognize those distortion and support you and make you move away from that distortion. So it has been contributed largely to depression. The prevailing notion about depression is labeled as anger directed inwards, which is very true. According to CT therapies, depression is that where your anger, your frustration goes inside, develops the depression. Started viewing depression as cognitive distortion. Also, Beck stated that depression is a cognitive distortion, which is unhelpful thinking. Let's talk about more other applications. Currently, the cognitive therapy is for family therapies also, which is it started being used as a family therapy where we understand the scenarios and the cognition of the family to deal with anxiety disorders. Parent training we do, skill training is done, and many more areas. So it's now dwelling into new ways, and the nature of the therapy is brief. Remember, it's again like behavior therapy, brief. It's client empowering because the change is happening in the client's cognition. The client is empowered, learns systematization and structure, and also this therapy makes it easy to transfer the correct cognition to all the situation. So the fact that the technique of the cognitive therapy is so basic that we can use it to counter every unhelpful habit. So probing, non-probing questions, Socratic questions can be used everywhere. So when we say that it can be used everywhere, that suggests that Socratic questioning, which we spoke at the beginning, can be used as any lock and key fit. You just have to understand the distortion, and then the questioning will start. So it's brief, again, inexpensive, quickly happens. The technique is so simple, so usable that you can change those questioning, non-probing questioning, and utilize it for many cognitive distortion, which is you can question as many cognitive distortion with that Socratic questioning. So did we realize the evaluation gave us a new thought that depression is also a cognitive distortion. It's coming from your must, oughts, and shoulds, coming from your negative thinking, coming from your labeling to yourself. It's coming from the fact that you have negatively posted yourself to be incorrect. You have catastrophized. You have enlarged the negative lens in front of you. So again, a very helpful technique this was. But there are some limitation of cognitive therapy. The limitation states that it's a very oversimplification thought of the world. So why it is so simple? It is trying to say you pick up any cognitive distortion, overgeneralization, or you pick up something which is labeling, the mental filter. You pick it up and you simply question it. So it's once you start questioning, they say you're able to identify the distortion, change the irrational thought into rational thought. Quite simple. That's a very simple thought of our inner humans. We overgeneralize and overthink a lot. So theoretical assumption assume that the mental process occur in a linear fashion. Distorted thought leading to a psychological distress, which could be brought into client's notice and which will remove the distortion. Very simple. I feel this is such a simplistic view about human nature. It does not happen that way. Humans are emotionally triggered people, socially triggered people. It has to be a little more logical, and the fact that it's overly simplistic, just by knowing the way it happens in a linear position, gets us to another problem of it. The role of emotions are overlooked, and as I said, the same problem was there in the behavior therapy. The same problem is in the cognitive therapy. They overlook emotions. That means they are unable to prohibit that the psychological distress is apart the emotion. This is not possible. Once you are overthinking, there are umpteen amount of distressing emotion that comes into play and make it worse. That's the reason that you catastrophize it. So that was one major problem which happened with cognitive therapy and behavior therapy alike. Cognitive oversimplification, and the next was the role of emotion is not managed. So you feeling sad, bad, mad, frustrated is completely overlooked. This completes with bigger chunk of the therapies, which was cognitive therapy and behavior therapy, the therapies which are used maximally in our country, cost benefit, temporary, usable. That completes with behavior and cognitive therapy of Unit 6. Thank you.